Sequels are supposed to be a reason to be excited, right? While there's plenty of great standalone games, recent heavyweights like Red Dead Redemption 2 and God of War build on their predecessors. In fact, the majority of the Game of the Year award winners have done just that for the past few years, with the likes of Breath of the Wild, Dragon Age Inquisition, Skyrim, and GTA 5 all taking home the grand prize in recent years. That's because sequels can iron out the kinks from the first offering. Spider-Man 2, for example, will probably feature less skulking around as Mary Jane and more, actual Spider-Man. However, sometimes sequels tinker a little too much. Either because of rushed deadlines, cut budgets, or just misunderstanding what the fans want, they drop brilliant elements that were present in the first game. Not all the games on this list are necessarily bad, but they each lost a sense of charm that the previous titles in the sequels provided. I'm Will for WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game sequels that pointlessly took away things fans loved. 10. Skins and moves. Marvel Ultimate Alliance. Kicking off the list with one that is such an odd and seemingly illogical decision, considering the first Marvel Ultimate Alliance was a resounding success. More of the same would have likely made fans happy, but instead, Ultimate Alliance 2 made everything objectively worse. Firstly, in the original game, each character came with a set of 4 or 5 unlockable suits. In the sequel, they only got a couple. It's not a big deal in terms of how the game is played, but it can have a bigger impact on a player's experience. I mean, hell, I like to look good when I kick ass, you know what I'm saying? Second, we had less combat moves as character-specific grapples disappeared, as well as a much shallower pool of RPG features in terms of how you spec your hero out. So we had an immediate aesthetic downgrade that only extended to watered-down gameplay mechanics too. A huge part of these superhero games is you feeling like you are actually heroes. Yeah, I know it's cliche, but it's the truth. And the truth is that the first MUA did make you feel kind of like you were a superhero fighting in the game, with all the possibilities that entailed. The sequel just reminded you how good the first one was, and that you were playing a very limited video game. 9. Tactical combat scenarios. Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls is so known for its difficulty that it's become shorthand for difficulty itself. A couple of years ago, you couldn't set foot on the internet without someone labeling Cuphead or Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon or Tetris as the Dark Souls of whatever. And sure, 99% of the time they're going too far, it just reinforces that if you pick up Dark Souls, you should expect difficulty. Dark Souls 2 was no different in that regard, so at least it got the main thing right. However, the tactical approach needed to conquer the first game was dropped for War of Attrition style battle systems and level layouts, making it difficult in a completely different and honestly less rewarding way. The difficulty in the first game was more to do with trial and error, or very careful improvisation, alongside the unforgiving nature with which mistakes were punished. You needed skill and an eye for tactical thought to figure out exactly how you were going to topple the big bads, let alone make it out of the tutorial. The second game felt more like you were constantly in horde mode, fighting off endless swarms of slashable enemies. It was still difficult, but not in the way fans had come to expect. 8. Exploration. Dragon Age 2. Honestly, Dragon Age 2 could make a fair claim to being the best game on this particular list. Its characterization is excellent as usual, its narrative is arguably the strongest of the trilogy, and if Hawke is played to be likable, they easily have the biggest personality of all the protagonists. Despite this, there is one criticism that continues to hound Dragon Age 2 wherever the trilogy is discussed: the map. After Origins took you to various kingdoms and gave you a relatively huge open world to explore, 2 forces you to spend the majority of your time in the city of Kirkwall. It's a city that vibrates with life, but it's a single city nonetheless. Dragon Age is an epic saga with a fantasy setting. Players can expect a massive map. On a first playthrough, many found themselves wondering when they'd be able to explore the rest of the region, only to realize that you can't. Sorry. The worst part though is the heavy use of caves. Dungeon crawling is to be expected, but several of the routes were either tweaked slightly or just completely recycled again and again. It was strangely and unnecessarily lazy in a game that got almost everything else perfect. 7. Creation Center, FIFA 14. Creation Center used to be a FIFA mainstay, with slight upgrades added to it year on year until it suddenly disappeared entirely in FIFA 14. At the time, EA argued that with a switch to a new engine, they could no longer support Creation Center, which, let's be real, is total nonsense. Obviously they could if they wanted to. Still, even if players took them at their word, it's hard to believe those technological limitations still exist today. In FIFA 19, you can see every bead of spittle from Harry Maguire's angry yells. It's hard to imagine they lack the budget for a once-beloved game mode. Creation Center allowed you to make new players, teams, leagues, and tournaments. In various versions, you could customize kits and crests, either to make a team from a league not on the game, or just build your Sunday League team's kit and stick yourself up front with the big boys. But alas, dear friends, no more. Who would have thought EA, of all people, could screw up a beloved sequel? Battlefront 2. 6. The charming aesthetic. Prince of Persia, Warrior Within. This was either going to be Warrior Within or the god-awful Bomberman revival, as they both suffered from a similar issue. Wanting to be their own mid-noughties version of badass, both games opted for a dark, new metal approach that completely ruined the tone fans loved. The prince always had a sword, but in Sands of Time he was charming and witty. The dark and grungy corridors might have worked if the prince himself played against it. The likes of Uncharted have explored dark caverns before, but Drake always kept things light with humour. The prince in this game is mirthless, and the whole thing feels dreary and angsty. Jordan Mechner, the original creator who had also worked on the predecessor Sands of Time, summed up how most people felt. He claimed he, quote, wasn't a fan of the art direction or the violence, story, characters, voice acting, or visual style, which is pretty much to say he hated all of it. 5. The Quarians, Mass Effect Andromeda. The Quarians are arguably the most interesting race in the Mass Effect series, and through Tali have one of the franchise's poster girls in their roster. They're mentioned in passing in Andromeda, but that's simply not good enough. Many players expected their arc to be found in an early mission, because surely they weren't going to be cut completely. Surely! It's abundantly clear that they were being saved for DLC, which, given the poor sales and BioWare focusing on Anthem... Yeah, do you guys remember Anthem? That DLC will now never materialize. If Andromeda had been a huge success and the DLC released on time with an engaging story, this criticism might have been forgotten. With or without it though, the point stands that such a key part of the universe should never have been chopped off to charge extra for later. Previous Mass Effect DLCs have dug into lesser explored side stories. They never paywalled the plot, except maybe the From the Ashes DLC from Mass Effect 3. But anyway, there's a lot of nitpicking you can make about Andromeda, and whether it deserves the criticism it gets is a debate for another day. Leaving the Quarians out was a shameless cash grab to get people to buy the DLC, and it backfired spectacularly. 4. Tension-filled horror, Dead Space 3. With FIFA and Mass Effect Andromeda, and to a lesser extent Dragon Age 2, there is a clear pattern of EA getting involved in development and muddying up sequels as a result. Plodding along in these less than illustrious footsteps is Dead Space 3, the final and, frankly, worst entry in the Dead Space series. Whether Dead Space 3 is a good game is irrelevant here. It cut out the key part of what made Dead Space Dead Space. But for what it's worth, the clunky campaign wasn't really worth it anyway. The first two Dead Space games were built around suspense, jump scares, and the creeping thought that you were being constantly stalked. The third entry is still scary, in that you're battling monsters, but there's no real fear. There's no holding your breath along passageways because the creatures just rush at you and force you into an action shootout. They don't hide anymore, they just run at you as you shoot them from behind cover. The core fanbase saw right through it and didn't want an action game. Players who might have enjoyed it didn't want to pick up the third game in a trilogy they'd never played before on account of not liking horror games. It tried to change things up and as a result ended up appealing to no one. And there's a lesson, kids, always be yourself. 3. The entire reason you played, PacMan. PacMan is one of the most recognizable protagonists of all time in gaming, but that's nothing to do with his personality. He's a yellow circle with a mouse who bobs around a maze collecting dots, and that's all there is to it. Like the paddle from Pong, he's not really meant to have a sort of narrative. It's just fun. That makes Namco's decision to make a sequel all the more bizarre. They could have gone with new mazes, different power-ups, changed the ghost AI, all would have been acceptable upgrades. Instead, they gave PacMan a point-and-click adventure game. Yeah, really. You'd say they were trying to cash in on PacMan's name by adding him to a point-and-click that was supposed to be a new IP, but honestly, what is there to cash in on? Okay, his name is recognizable, but he's known for arcade-style mazes. Why would we root for him? Sure, we all love Red Dead, but if the next game was an online cooperative multiplayer rhythm game dancing to underground new metal K-pop fusion, would anyone really buy it? Okay, I mean, that sounds pretty awesome, but you get my point. It was a stupid idea. 2. Puzzles and suspense, Resident Evil 6. Executive producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi compared himself and the fans to being two parents, each disagreeing on what's best for their zombie-killing child. Obviously, you're never going to have a game that pleases absolutely everyone, but when almost the entire fanbase disagrees with a sharp change of direction, it's poor form to try and argue that they simply don't get it. Resi 6 wasn't even marketed as survival horror, instead Capcom claiming it as a dramatic horror. Considering Resident Evil pretty much invented the genre, that's a big sign that things had changed. Most people saw right through this though, and it was referred to a simple action shooter for the majority of its shelf life. The puzzles that had hitherto been a huge part of gameplay were all but gone as well, replaced by action set pieces. The wonky campaigns and awful cover mechanics meant that it was a poor game all round, but fans would never have to put up with a subpar offering from such a beloved franchise if it just stayed true to its roots. Thankfully, it went back to it for the excellent Resi 7. 1. Difficulty, weapons, and Dante's design. Devil May Cry 2. While we've already talked about Dark Souls being the go-to overused metaphor for difficulty, Devil May Cry is no cakewalk either. At least, other Devil May Crys aren't. The second entry in the franchise clearly had the challenge twisted down, and there's no clear explanation as to why. As well as difficulty, the weapons just became slightly more powerful versions of themselves, rather than offering unique and varied ways to battle. Along with that, strategy went out the window in favour of a much less refined bludgeon and bullet sponge approach to boss battles. Finally, Capcom made the same mistake as Ubisoft did with Warrior Within. Dante, like the Prince of Persia, became so edgy you could cut yourself just by touching the controller. While not as happy-go-lucky as the Prince was, Dante definitely had a sense of suave charm. He was broody, but he was nowhere near to the gothic extent he went in DMC2, becoming almost a parody of himself. With a much easier campaign, less versatile weapons, and near unrecognizable protagonist, DMC2 is the shining example of why you shouldn't tinker with things the fans love in a sequel. And there you have it folks, 10 video game sequels that pointlessly took away things fans loved. Extra special shout out to the Pokemon franchise, which has been destroying my dreams installment by installment for the past 20 years. Feel free to drop this video a like if you enjoyed it, and drop me a follow on Twitter at @USlyDogU. I'm Will for WhatCulture, thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.